This is Carol Marsh coming to you from Bahrain. The date is March 8th, 1993. This is the third in the Bahrain broadcast series, such as it is. This tape will be entirely about my trip to Oman. I went on January 27th and came back on February 5th during the semester break at Bahrain University. I went with a teaching colleague, an American woman named Ingrid. She's actually from Honolulu, and she speaks Arabic. She spent 6 years in Kuwait and has been here in Bahrain for 4 years. She says once the desert gets in your shoes, you can't leave. But her Arabic is pretty good. She said she learned it in Kuwait, that they don't speak English there. On the other hand, here in Bahrain, you hardly need any Arabic at all. I'll include a map of Oman along with this tape with some of the key cities marked so that you get some sense of the geography. Looking at a larger scale map, Oman runs nearly the length of the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. To the north, it borders the United Arab Emirates. The central part of Oman borders the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the southern part of Oman shares a border with the what's now the Yemen Republic, North and South Yemen. On the seaward side, northern Oman faces the Gulf of Oman. Then heading east and around the tip down towards the south is the Arabian Sea, and the southernmost part is on the Indian Ocean. The interior border with Oman, in fact, there hasn't been a definitive border until fairly recently. On the inward side, including a great deal of the border of Oman, is what's called the empty quarter, al-Rubal Khali in Arabic, and it is in fact that. It's sand and nothing else. Because the terrain, in fact, shifts vaguely from season to season, from year to year. There has not been a definitive border between Oman and these three countries that border it. There's been some squabbling of late over exactly where the border is because of the oil potential in this region. So I understand under the auspices of the United Nations, fairly recently, within the last few years, a definitive border has been set. Up to that point, there was only a vague dotted line that ran through these countries. I had a chance to do some homework before I went on this trip. I was not able to find much as far as touristic information, so I read a bunch of history books, the best of which was a book called Arabian Sands by an English fellow named Wilfred Thesiger. Thesiger, from early 1940s for about 5 years, lived and traveled with the Bedouin tribes, the indigenous tribes of this desert area. He wore Arab clothing, of course spoke Arabic. They didn't understand English at all, and lived as they did, and told wonderful tale of his 5 years of traveling with them. So I got a great deal of my history from his book. I'm looking for the book here to buy it, to bring it back. It was such a fascinating story. But he was one of the first Englishmen that most of these Arabs the Bedouin in that area had contact with. And they were beginning to explore for oil at that point. I might make a comment about the word Bedu, the name. The English name that we use, Bedouin, in fact is a double plural. The U and the In are both plurals applied to different parts of speech. So I will refer to them as Bedu, which means plural for this tribe. It's not a specific tribe. There are many, many families within this group ethnically called the Bedu. In fact, on the coming in on the airplane, the customs papers that we had to fill out asked for all the usual information, and the last part was either your surname or your tribal name. So tribal identity is still very strong in Oman. I also bought and read a book on the architecture of the Gulf, which prepared me for some of what I was going to see. That was quite interesting. That book I'll bring home also. And the last book that I really enjoyed was called Sultan in Oman. Well, this book was written by a guy named Jan Morris, who does a lot of travel writing. He apparently his book on Venice, in fact, is a classic. He's an interesting story in himself. Uh, he traveled through Oman as John Morris. Uh, he's had a wife and a couple of kids, and later had a sex operation, and now publishes under the name of Jan Morris. So I've heard a bit about him from some of the people here. Jan Morris's book was written about mid 1950s, about 10 years after Thesiger's book, and indicates that it's actually very funny. He takes a trip through the entire country, um, and really points out how little the country had changed. Now, historically, this country was called the Sultanate of Oman and Muscat. Muscat, or Muscat, depending on how you pronounce it, is now the capital of the country called the Sultanate of Oman. But until 1950, it was actually two different countries, or under two different rulers. And it was only with this trip that Jan Morris took with the then Sultan that actually unified the country into the one country we know politically now as Oman. Now, of course, because these tribes, Bedou tribes, are nomadic, there was not any particular need for a political boundary between Oman and Yemen or Saudi, because and United Arab Emirates also, because these Bedou, who were the tribes of that area, didn't necessarily recognize the authority of any of these kings or sultans, but in fact had their own tribal authority. And over this tribal authority were leaders called imams, I-M-A-M, who are in fact religious leaders. And these imams had their own political boundaries, areas which they guarded fiercely. And until 1955, I believe, as I said, the district of the area was called the Sultanate of Oman and Muscat, because there was not a central authority. The various imams were able to keep Westerners out, literally out of their district. Thesiger, although he was totally apolitical and had the confidence of many of the different Bedou leaders and the sheikhs, even up into the United Arab Emirates, gave him free passage through their territory because he was known as a peaceful man. And he wasn't interested in oil. He traveled as an Arab with the Bedou and lived as they did. But he was refused entry also because he was a Westerner. He was an infidel, a non-Muslim. In Jan Morris's book, he talks about he was the first Westerner to go into many of these areas, only because he was accompanying the Sultan, who would eventually become the Sultan of all of Oman. And as part of his party, this foreigner was allowed into these areas because militarily this Sultan had overwhelmed the other imams. I'll skip the specific names of any of these people because they won't mean anything, and they can be terribly confusing because an Arab has got 4, 5, sometimes 6 names, which list his whole genealogy. But basically, the Sultan who united all of these different tribal loyalties was Sultan of this Oman until 1970, when his only son came to power as the Sultan of the Sultanate of Oman. There was oil money. I believe they started pumping oil in the 1940s and more fruitfully during the 1960s. So, and there's a lot of oil in Oman. So the money was rolling in. But this old sultan was a man from a past era, and until 1970, in fact, when the new sultan came into power, there were no roads, literally no blacktop roads in Oman. There were 2 schools, maybe 1 or 2 hospitals. The people were not allowed to even wear eyeglasses. This old sultan wanted to keep the status quo, and the country was closed to foreigners. We heard rumors of how the new sultan came to power. He was, as a young man, he grew up in Salalah, in the southern part of the island, which we visited, of the country which we visited. He was the only son of this sultan and the sultan's wife, who was a Bedou, in fact. Quite unusual, because these Arabs have very large families. He was sent off to England as a young man to study there, and then became a pilot and served with the German Air Force, or I don't know, for some reason he was in Germany as a pilot. And then came back to, when he finished, about 10 years abroad, came back to Salalah and was virtually imprisoned by his father, the father who wanted to maintain the status quo. Now, the father, this old sultan, apparently hardly even left his palace in Salalah for about the last 10 or 12 years of his life. He was completely out of touch with everything. We heard that the new sultan, whose name is Kawus, in fact murdered his father in order to take power. Don't know how true that was. When we asked roundabout questions of different Omanis when we were in Oman, they sort of shrugged and said there were a lot of stories. Apparently the old father did in fact imprison, sort of a house arrest, his son, the current sultan, and the British helped the current sultan, through the British military, helped the current sultan get out from under his imprisonment and escape, and he went someplace else in Oman. In this Jan Morris book, he says that the old sultan was banished to London, and in fact lived out his days there in relative obscurity, apparently. But in any case, the development of Oman, the modern history, really only dates from 1970. And I was amazed at the progress that they've made in 20 years. Again, that was part of what was so surprising on this trip. In the reading that I was able to do, what little I could find, and photographs, I knew that Oman would be different from the rest of the Gulf, but in fact the landscape was really stunning. These steep, rugged mountains that are blue-black run everywhere, crisscross, zigzag, and random ranges through the country. Parts of it are entirely impassable, which is one of the reasons that these imams were able to maintain from their fortresses, maintain the absolute authority over their different regions for so many years. Between these mountain ranges, at the foot of these mountain ranges, are fed by mountain rainwaters and so on, are oases, which are just spectacularly beautiful. They are enormous areas of palm trees. In most of the area, they're date palms. In the southern area, down towards Salalah, in fact, it's fairly tropical there, and they are coconut palms with papayas interspersed among them. So that contrasted with the blue of the ocean, which in fact is quite deep. The Arabian Gulf, certainly around Bahrain, is fairly shallow and doesn't get the intense blue colors that you get in a deeper ocean. But it was just stunning in Oman, and the beaches were miles and miles in as far as you could see in many directions until the mountains came down to the sea. And they were the brightest, clearest white sand. Ingrid from Honolulu said that it looks, in fact, it did look exactly like Hawaii in many places, except that there was absolutely no people on the beaches. Well, Oman is about an hour and a half flight from Bahrain, and we crossed the Arab Emirates on the way to Oman and got a good look at the landscape there, if you can call it that. It's just miles and miles of sand until we hit Oman, and then you cross over these rugged mountains with range after range of literally impassable mountains. We landed in Muscat, and the airport's about half an hour out of town. Now, the town of Muscat, in fact, is not a town as in any sense that you could visualize it. There are, in fact, any number of little areas, Muscat and Rui and, several others, Mutra, little probably were at one point villages, but each one is separated from the other in what could be called, loosely called a metropolitan area, by these mountain ranges. So the highways twist and turn, freeways, mind you, modern freeways twist and turn around these mountain ranges through these wadis. So that all of Muscat and Rui and the other different districts around what is the metropolitan area of Oman is in fact quite green and very modern, most of it. Muscat, we didn't spend too much time there. It's the political capital, the government, the head of the government. In fact, only 2 or 3 trips we took over there, we walked around at night because there's not an awful lot to see. Never got to a single museum in the country. There are some, but there was just too much else to see. We did spend more time in the area called Mutra, which is another inlet, a bay, along this, let's see, that's the Arabian Sea coast. And Mutra is the old seaport, and in fact there is a row of magnificent old merchants' homes lining what the beach used to come right up to the ground floor of these, so where the storehouses were, the warehouses, and the actual living quarters began on the second floor. The first day that we were there, the weather was quite cool, in fact a bit overcast, and it kind of sprinkled the first day and a half, but then it began to warm up, and it was short-sleeve shirt weather. This was in January, so it must have been in the high 70s. I'm told that Muscat during the year registers the hottest temperatures around the world, and I can believe it. It must be appalling. I'm talking about temperatures in the 50s, 50 centigrade, which is, 120 plus, with 100% humidity. It must be pretty awful in the summer, but it was lovely in January. We spent a couple of days in Muscat, and then Ingrid, my traveling companion, was just exhausted. She'd done a very heavy semester. So one day we went out to a place called the Al Bustan, which is a 5-star hotel, which was magnificent. And the beach there, in fact, I'll include a photograph in the pictures that I send with this tape. The beach there was just exactly what she wanted. She and I are both beach people, so we immediately, wherever we landed, dropped our suitcases at the hotel and headed for the beach and walked on the beach. The second day that we were there, she decided she was just too tired and took a taxi out to El Bustan, which is about 20 minutes out of Muscat. And I got on one of the local buses and had a real adventure. Took about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, and went to a city called Rustak, if you can find that on the map. It's, in English, is spelled R-U-S-T-A-Q. Rustak was one of the ancient capitals of Oman. Mind you, the history of Oman dates back to Persian time, when the Persians were originally rulers of some of this land across the Gulf from Persia. Rustak is as you'll see from the photograph, is one of these towns. Actually, it's a fairly large town. It was a famous inland town in its day, and it is in an oasis. I spent the entire day wandering around this village, and the people were so nice. Because I don't speak any Arabic at all, I was really at the mercy of the cab drivers, the bus drivers, and the locals, and they were very careful to see that I didn't get lost. I told the bus driver where I wanted to go in the few words of Arabic I picked up, wanted to go to Rustak, and he, at the right time, pulled off after about an hour driving down the highway, pulled off and told me it was time to get out, dumped me on the side of the highway. And another man got out and indicated that he was also going to Rustak and that I should follow him. And this other guy pointed out where I should catch the bus to go back to Mutra, where we were staying. I knew from my architecture book that Rustak had a very famous old fort, so I asked around and headed in that direction. When I got off the bus, decided where to get off the bus in the town. I had to walk quite a ways. I went too far through town, but that was all right. I got to see a lot of it. You could see the fort from any place in town. It was so large. In fact, the photograph that I will include was taken from the top of the fort looking one direction across this town. There's an equal amount of this city on the other side of the fort. I had gotten there, this was on a Friday, and Friday for Muslims is the day of the required communal prayer. So I got to the fort about just prior to 11 o'clock, and they were closing because they used the central courtyard of the fort for the communal Friday prayers. So the man told me to come back at 1 o'clock when they opened again, the guard there at the fort. So I had a couple hours to kill. So I had my camera with me. I spent 2 hours, in fact, walking up one direction from the fort, which is fairly centrally located in town, and walked up these paths through this dense palm groves of this very picturesque village. Again, in my architecture book, I had read that in Oman, unusual 2- and 3-story mud buildings that, in fact, are highly decorated because it's so dry there, the mud doesn't fall apart. So these houses are still lived in. I was surprised to see some air conditioners and television antennas sticking out of these fairly primitive mud houses. But the mud houses, of course, are built for the climate, unlike the cement job that I'm living in, which, in fact, without the air conditioner, is just like living in an oven. I've included also a picture of some of the buildings in Rustak. I wandered around for hours, collected, as usual, a bunch of little kids. The children study English in school there, beginning about 6th grade, so they're 10 or 11 years old, I guess. And they all have learned the same things, which are basically, hello, how are you, and what's your name? And they chanted this, following me along. They're really cute little kids. I did get a picture of some of the girls there, but most of them they're still so shy and so unused to foreigners, Westerners especially, that the kids tend to run away when I ask them if I can take their picture. Now, I wandered for an hour and a half at least up one side of this town, just following the villages, the paths through the village, and then went back to see the fort, spent probably an hour in there. They actually had a guide that gave a tour. I was with an Egyptian family with, God, I don't know how many children they had. These kids were everywhere. So the tour was sort of English-Arabic. And then by this time it was actually getting quite warm, so I sat on there's a stream that runs through the fort, sat by that for a while and cooled off, and then headed off the other direction, up the other side of the valley, this long valley, at the base of the mountains that Rustak sits in. I hadn't gone too far when a fellow stopped. Of course, anybody who speaks real English wants to practice. And we chatted for a bit. He asked me who I was and what in the world I was doing by myself in this village that nobody else comes to visit. And he told me that there was some water, something at the top of this hill. Um, so I hiked up there. In fact, he sent a bunch of the village kids up who didn't speak any English at all, but he told them in Arabic where to take me, what I was supposed to go see. And I headed off with this band of kids leading me up into up the village, up the side of this mountain. Well, about halfway up the mountain, a villager coming the other direction began shouting in Arabic at these kids and obviously shooed them away. I tried to explain that the children were my guides that they were showing me, and they were obviously explaining to him, but he would have none of it. So he sent these kids back down the hillside to their neighborhood, and I continued up by myself. Well, what I discovered at the top of this hill is a thermal springs. In fact, I climbed out of the palm groves and not too far, but a bit up the side of the mountain to the mouth of these thermal springs. And they've got a large pool built on where you can't swim in it there, but there's just a pool of water where you can look into where these springs come out of the ground. From these springs, down the side of the hill that I had just walked up, and in fact all the way across the other side of the village, is a system of canals called, in this country, in Oman they call them falak. In Bahrain they have a similar system called kanat, which are all basic variations of the word channel, if you look carefully at the spelling and the pronunciation. In Oman, every place I went, it's crisscrossed with these channels, and obviously closer up to the mouth of the thermal springs, the water's a lot hotter. In fact, they've got built over these channels, they have little cement houses that are divided into cubicles inside. There's no door on them. There's a minimum of privacy. But people go in there and bathe with their clothes on, mind you. I went into the little house at the top near the thermal springs and put my feet in and found it was so hot I had to pull them out immediately. The water comes out of there very, very hot. Further down the mountainside, obviously it's not as hot. And many places in the village, I saw the women with the dirty dishes and the laundry and the kids all in the same water. It can't be very sanitary. But there's obviously a lot of water there. Because the mountains are so high, there's a great deal of rain in the mountains during the winter, which channels down through aquifers down to the villages that are in these wadis. Now, as the country develops, there's more demand for water than the aquifers can supply. So again, I read this in the architecture book. Throughout the mountains of Oman, they've built what are called recharge dams, which are, in fact, dams that catch the rainwater, which then filters down to resupply, to recharge the aquifers. So ideally, there will never be a shortage of water. There will always be plenty of natural water in Oman. But the water there really is what makes the difference between Oman and what I saw of the Emirates from the air, and certainly here in Bahrain. The northern edge of Bahrain, the island, has quite a bit of water, and it's very green. Down here in the middle part where I live, it's actually quite dry, and the southern part of the island is just plain desert. There isn't any water there at all, sweet water. Well, I wandered around the village till about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then decided I'd better start making my way back to the hotel. I promised Ingrid I'd be back before dark. And at that point, she should send the police to come and find me, because we had no idea what I was going to discover, what my day would be like when I set out. Had no trouble getting a ride they have these pickup trucks with a cab. And I got a ride in one of those back to the highway, which is about a half hour. And at the highway, picked up another ride back to the bus station in Rui, near Muscat. From Muscat north, along the Arabian Gulf, is between the mountains and the sea, is a very fertile plain called the plain of Bahrain. But the major city there is a town called Sohar. Sohar is about a 3-hour bus trip from Muscat, and it was just too far. I decided not to do that. We just didn't have time for it. Sohar now is just a major city, nothing distinct. But historically, it was, they think, the home of Sinbad the sailor. The stories of Sinbad are a combination of Persian and Arab and, in fact, even Greek tales. The stories that come down to us now, they probably were in fact based on several people. But the character of Sinbad has been identified as a specific person. He was born probably in Sohar, but all of his voyages, in fact, he left Baghdad in what is now Iraq and traveled down the river to what was then the port city of Basra, and set off from Basra on his voyages. These are both names that are familiar now because of the Gulf War. The history of Sohar, in fact, dates back to pre-Islamic times. It was the capital of the Persians in the Arab area, and in the 10th century, in fact, became one of the greatest ports of Arabia, was famous and wealthy throughout that part of the world, because they sent dhows, these local ships, to India and China. The Omanis, historically, like the Bahrainis, were seafarers, and a great deal of their wealth came from not any indigenous produce product, although they have mined copper for many, many centuries. But they were merchants, basically, carrying goods from Arabia, Africa and Arabia, and across into the Indus Valley to the east, which is now Pakistan, and the other way to Mesopotamia and so on, which is now Iraq and Lebanon, that area. The voyages of Sinbad that I mentioned are, of course, part of what in the Western world we call Arabian Nights, and here are called the 1001 Nights. The stories of the wife, Shahrazad, told over 1001 Nights. I've read them again, a lot of them, and they're actually quite interesting. There's a great deal of Arab culture in these. Ingrid and I didn't spend very much time around the Muscat area. It's basically big city, and we decided we'd rather spend what little time we had seeing more typically Omani places. So we headed for, one morning, got on the bus, and headed for the town of Nizwa, Nizwa, if you can find that on the map. It's in the mountains. It was about a 4-hour trip from Muscat to Nizwa. Nizwa was also at one time a capital of Oman, ruled by a fairly fanatical imam who kept this district, particularly around Nizwa, he kept the locals subjugated and the foreigners out, absolutely out. There were no foreigners in this district whatsoever until this trip around 1955, when the then Sultan went in to establish his superiority as the political leader. Nizwa was not nearly as pretty as Rustak, although very similar. It's a walled city with an immense fort built in 1670s by this imam. This was called the Portuguese period because throughout the Gulf area, there's a Portuguese fort here in Bahrain, and also in Oman. The Portuguese, who of course were great sailors in those days, overran the coastal area and established their authority in this northern part of Oman. The fort was eventually taken over. When the Portuguese were run out, the fort was taken over by these locals. The government of this new Sultan Qaboos bin Said has done an enormous amount of, I couldn't even say rebuilding, because there wasn't really much in the country to rebuild. They have, with the help of UNESCO money, been restoring these really magnificent forts. The fort in Nizwa we went into also was just enormous and has been reconstructed, restored. This fort was used until the 1980s, in fact. I'll include a picture of Nizwa, too, of downtown Nizwa. The government, as I said, has built a proper shopping area, has built a new market in the central district. The old market has been moved outside of town. We did visit it, but it wasn't much. I don't think I even took any pictures there. Because the architecture in Oman is so distinct, well, I asked quite a few questions, and again, I'd read a bit in this architecture book. There is a long procedure that one has to go through to different government agencies before anything can be built, and then it's very carefully controlled. The result is a very harmonious appearance to the country. They have made, one of the requirements is that while you can build now with modern materials like concrete and glass and so on, the architecture has to be distinctly Arabian and, in fact, Omani. So the buildings are all very much traditional styles. And in addition, the colors, we notice, the colors are controlled also. The colors that are chosen have to be in harmony with the local background. So we saw 101 variations of the beigey colors of the sand and the mountains painted on the buildings, and white. They're also allowed to use white. The signs on the front of the buildings have to be approved by the government. There's clearly a limited number of variations. So you don't get this tacky hodgepodge of different kinds of advertising. There are no billboards in the country. We didn't see anything hanging on any of the buildings, even in the major cities around Rui and Muscat, Mutra, that area, Koat and Sib, were some of the districts around Muscat. But they've been very careful about maintaining a very harmonious and quite pleasing to the eye visual image of the country. And Nizwa was certainly an example of that. In Nizwa, we stayed in a place called the Nizwa Motel, which was probably the nicest place that we stayed. The village of Nizwa, and it's not much more than a village, is at a crossroads between a major highway that runs from Muscat to Nizwa, and then from Nizwa you can drive the 1,000 and some miles to Salalah down this major 4-lane tarmac highway, or at Nizwa, rather than going south, you can turn west, and the road goes directly to another oasis called Buraimi, which is on the border with the United Arab Emirates. So Nizwa is, in fact, quite a crossroads, and there was one motel in town. It's a low one-story building with rooms around a very lovely garden with a pool in the middle of it, and it was quite enchanting. The pool was ice cold, but the weather was lovely. We didn't swim, but we took our meals out in the garden. We were the only ones. Everybody else ate in this rather crummy, not crummy, but a plain, dimly lit dining room at the hotel. We spent, I think, 3 days around Nizwa, and at the motel was a crew from Omani television. There was an awful lot of coming and going. We did chat with some of them on the around the pool one evening. They go around all of Oman and make films of the different districts of Oman, which are put on television during Ramadan, because everybody watches television during Ramadan. This is the month of fasting, when they don't eat or drink all day. So by the afternoon, people are pretty well worn out. Most of the shops close during the day, so they go home and sit and watch television and wait until it gets dusk so they can eat again. So the Omani government is trying to encourage the Omani people, rather than the ones with money to travel, rather than get on a plane for India or the other direction to Egypt, that they should do more traveling around their own country and get to know it. So in any case, this television crew had been to all of the places around Nizwa and knew exactly where we should go and gave us a lot of awfully good information. In fact, we met a couple of them in Mutra, in around Muscat, when we came back and got a very good tour of some of the places there. We went to the villages of Jabrin and Bahla, and I think the other one's called Alhambra, none of which were probably on the map that I'm going to send because they were such tiny villages, but really very beautiful places, each one in an oasis. And the town of Bahla, which, in fact, I'll include a picture of some of the architecture there. This is the wall, the mihrab, it's on the western wall in this country, facing Mecca, of an old mosque that's fallen down. Bahla was another one of these ancient capitals of Oman, like Rustak, a capital that was controlled by a imam. The town of Bahla was particularly interesting because this mud and stone wall that encircles the city, in fact, goes the whole 12 kilometers around the town and includes the town's main palm grove as well. And there are old towers at frequent intervals along this old mud and stone wall. So we hired a taxi driver in Nizwa to take us out to see these places, and he took us around for a whole day. In fact, we gave him the names of places where we wanted to go, names that we'd been given from this Omani TV crew, and he certainly knew where they were because he was a local from Nizwa, but said that some of these places he'd never been there himself. This guy spoke no English whatsoever. This was an entirely Arabic day for Ingrid. She said, and it was clear, how difficult it is to speak all day in a foreign language, but she did a real excellent job as far as I was concerned of being the tour guide. As I make this tape, I'm picking selected photographs and, in fact, postcards out of my 3 rolls of film. I certainly can't send the whole thing. I did end up buying photographs of the people in their costumes because we weren't there long enough to be able to go to the markets on the right days. But you'll see how distinct the costumes are of the Omani. This white gown that the men wear, it's called thobe in some countries and dishdash in others of these Gulf countries, has a distinct tassel that hangs off the placket on the front. And the men have these special caps that they wear. These caps, mind you, were terribly expensive. They ran about, $50 to $70, commercially made ones. But their wives or mothers usually make them. The Omani men also tie the headgear. Theirs are tied up rather than hanging. And the Omanis have very, very colorful costumes, whereas in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and also in Saudi, the men only wear a white thobe. In Oman, we saw them in all the colors of the rainbow. In fact, in one of these postcards of the cities, the villagers at the market in the souk in Nizwa, you can see the women's costumes too. Oman was the only country of the people of this Arab peninsula to actually do any colonizing. And they colonized the island of Zanzibar off the East African coast, roughly off Tanganyika. And a couple of islands in the Indian Ocean towards India. I forget the names of them. But the African influence was very obvious in Oman, more so in the south in Salalah. But certainly among the faces of the people that we saw, some were very, very African, East African, the broad faces with the flat noses. And heavily jeweled. The women many of them had very large gold rings through their noses, in addition to the ones who didn't have their heads covered, the gold rings, quite large gold earrings. No place in Oman did we see very many women covered with this black abaya that all the women wear in these northern Gulf countries. On the contrary, they were very, very bright, colorful costumes, wild colors, lots of orange and yellow, and threads, gold threads through all of the fabric. The women like bright, shiny things, and both men and women, dress in very bright, decorative colors. From Nizwa, we went back directly to the airport and flew the 1,000 miles from Muscat to Salalah in the south. Salalah is the largest city in the district of Dhofar, which is on the border with Yemen. Salalah is a holiday destination certainly for all of the Arabs, and many of the Westerners, the people that I work with, have been there also. It was not at all what I expected. When they go there for holiday, there is one hotel, which is the Holiday Inn, which charges, I think the minimum is about $115 a night. It's about 15-20 minutes out of the city of Salalah, on, again, a magnificent beach, but there's nothing to do there. It's just a place to go and lay in the sun. There's not really much as far as activities in Salalah either. It's sort of a one-horse cowboy town that's just gotten a little bit bigger. There are two main shopping streets. We were able to find a hotel on one of them. An Indian man on the airplane who sat next to Ingrid gave us the name of a very good, clean, cheap hotel in the center of town. Ingrid and I got off the plane. We had a day flight. It takes about an hour to Salalah. Got to the hotel, dumped our stuff, and headed immediately for the beach. The beach of downtown Salalah is easily 3 miles long, and we walked most of it the first evening. There is not a single restaurant on the whole length of that beach, although it's lined with buildings, but they are just simply little low houses with nothing, no business at all there. They just simply have not developed for any facilities at all for tourists yet. The second day that we spent in Salalah, we hired a taxi driver who took us, we went from Salalah, east to the village of Taka, which is about 30 kilometers. I think that might be on the map. Yes, it's near Merbut. And I've included couple of pictures of this landscape. Now, Salalah sits on the Indian Ocean, and for the 3 months of the summer, gets the fringe of the monsoon rains. They don't get the heavy torrential rains that they do, say, in India, but instead there is a constant mist that hangs in the air for 3 months. Consequently, everything turns a lush green. And in fact, on the coast, where Salalah sits on the coast, there were dense groves of coconut palms, and in the midst of these coconut palms were papaya growing. We had people gave us papaya all the time. On the road out to Taka, about 3 kilometers from Taka, is what they think is the site of the kingdoms of Sheba and Himyareta. The Queen of Sheba, of course, is famous in Western literature. Her kingdom, I think, in fact, from my reading, probably stretched into a part of what is now Yemen, because the Yemeni also, in their literature, call themselves the Kingdom of Sheba, or the Land of Sheba. In our ride out this day, we spent most of the day. You'll see that the terrain is quite dry, desert, high desert, though it's very gravelly, not sand, that simply leads from the seashore up into these rugged mountains. Lots of camels all over Oman, in fact. But also, along this coastline, both ways from Salalah, are numerous lagoons. Now, these lagoons are different degrees of salinity, and depending on how salty the water was, in combination with the sweet water source there would be different kinds of vegetation. but we saw quite marshy ones around the hill that was, they think, the remains of Sheba's castle, fortress castle, um, and some that were not quite so bushy, but really just low swamps. But in all of them were migrating birds. We saw flamingos and pelicans and seagulls too, lots of seagulls. That was quite an interesting day. The next day, we went the other direction, got a different taxi driver, and drove from Salalah through the village of Rasut towards the Yemeni border. And initially it was the same kind of low, gravelly terrain, but quite soon we climbed into the mountains. And the mountains between Oman and Yemen are quite substantial. They have, one of the projects of this sultan is to connect every village in this country with a proper road. And they've done a remarkable job, as I said earlier. The road from through Oman to Yemen is not quite finished, but they have to pass some of the most rugged mountains that I've certainly ever seen. This taxi driver took us, maybe 30, 40 miles up into these mountains on what is a remarkable feat of engineering. This highway apparently is not quite finished, but so far has cost $35 million. I'm sorry, pounds sterling, double that for dollars. And it is the road goes in switchbacks up one side of the mountain, and then you'll cross very subtly over the top of the mountain, and then switchbacks down the other side of the mountain until you get to a point where you can cross over, switchbacks up the next mountain range, and so on. But it's just remarkable. In place, you can see where they have drilled and dynamited the face of the mountain off to flatten it enough to build a road on it. And then between each of these switchbacks, the mountain is terraced all the way up until the road, you meet the next road where it's coming back the next direction, and so on, all the way up the side of the mountain. Places where there may be some loose gravel have got a face of cement up the top of them. But mind you, you're looking up at each of these switchbacks, looking up as far as you can see up into the distance to the top of the mountain. The first evening that Ingrid and I headed for the beach, it was, not too late, maybe 3 or 4 in the afternoon. We, in fact, walked through the old market first, which wasn't too much, and then headed down for the beach. We'd walked a considerable distance on the beach, carrying our shoes, and we were in T-shirts. It was quite warm, and saw an old man who had pulled his fishing boat, up onto the beach. Now, the fishing boats there they look a bit like a kayak, in fact. They're quite long and narrow, only room for one man to sit in, a kayak without the covering on it, open like a rowboat, but very long and narrow. And we saw this old fellow. I've included a picture of him on the beach, and it was still enough daylight, so I said, let's go see what he's doing. And we went over to where he was working inside his boat and discovered that he was cleaning the fish that he caught that day. So we sat in the sand, and Ingrid began talking to him in Arabic. Well, Ingrid's father was Hawaiian and was also a fisherman. And as they talked, I snapped pictures, and of course the crowd began to draw. But the conversation was remarkable. I could get bits and pieces of it from the context and the few Arabic words that I've picked up. But the man asked the basic questions of, how are you, and who are you, and what are you doing here, and where's your husbands? So Ingrid, it's easier often simply to just lie rather than try and explain things. So she told him that our husbands were back at the hotel, and he asked how many children we had, and she said that she had, 3 or 4, and I had 3 or 4. And then carried on talking about fishing. And with other people around adding things to the conversation, people that were wandering by. Eventually, he, as we suspected, insisted that we take some fish with us. Now, mind you, each of these fillets was probably a foot long. Fillets, it was the fish, the body of the fish with a head and tail cut. They were enormous. And Ingrid said, well, we can't. We're just staying in a hotel. We haven't any way to cook it. But he insisted, and according to Arab hospitality, it's extremely rude to refuse someone's offer. So she said, well, all right, we'll take one and see if we can get a cook someplace. Well, of course, the ease with which she'd gotten through the first few questions about where are your husbands came back on us, because we had, according to her information, we had 9 more people waiting at the hotel for us. So we finally walked away from the old fisherman with 3 beautiful fish. And these things were quite heavy. We'd done a bit of shopping in the souk, and so had some plastic bags. We dumped everything into one bag, put the fish in another one, and then for the rest of the afternoon's walk took turns carrying the fish. But you can't pay them for these things, that for any kind of a favor or a gift. That would be quite insulting. So Ingrid had put a long-sleeve pink T-shirt with Hawaii written all over it in her bag when we set out from the hotel, and she gave that to the man for one of his 14 children. Typical of the hospitality that we received in Oman. We spent the rest of that afternoon walking around. In fact, we walked back down the beach we'd come down looking for some place to get these fish cooked, with no luck. By the time it got dark, we went there's a parallel street, street that runs parallel to this long corniche that's on the beach, and walked the length of that only to discover that it was simply 200 or 300 tailor shops, not a restaurant among them. We couldn't get the fish done there. So it was quite late and we were hungry. We flagged down a taxi and told him where we were staying, and he took us around kind of a roundabout way back in, because we'd walked right to the edge of town. As we were driving into town, Ingrid said, she was sitting in the front speaking Arabic with a taxi driver, and she said, oh, look, Carol, this is where they have the coconut stands, because we'd read that they sell coconuts there, where they, with a huge machete, they knock the husk off and then knock a hole through the eyes of the coconut and stick straws in. Well, when she indicated the coconut stands, the taxi driver swerved over to the side of the road and ordered coconuts all around. Refused to let us pay for it. So we sat for a while and talked with she talked in Arabic with the taxi driver and the coconut seller, and another guy who stopped for a coconut who actually spoke English came, and we all sort of sat around this coconut stand on the edge of the road chatting for a bit. We arrived back at the hotel with our shopping in one bag and our fish in another bag and our coconuts in hand, and so on. Again, typical of the hospitality that we met there. One morning while we were having breakfast at the hotel, we ate there because there was nothing else around. The owner of the hotel was in the dining room and sat down and had a cup of coffee with us. We had heard from one of the Indian employees there that he was a huge fat Arab, has got 4 wives and 34 children. But he wanted some suggestions from us on how to increase the tourism, the traffic at his hotel. So we told him about the various English newspapers that are available here throughout the Gulf, including the Gulf Daily News, which is the local paper here in Bahrain. Very nice chap. When we came back to the hotel, we found a couple of packages for us with some little beaded bottles inside a beaded bag, which he had given one to each of us as just a gift. But again, they were so nice, so generous, and everybody wanted to talk. I included a postcard that I bought of some of the women of Salalah. It's called Girls in Traditional Dress. The dress that these girls are wearing is the typical dress of that area. It's black polyester velveteen. If you can imagine, it'd be like wearing a plastic bag in that heat. I don't know how they can manage it. The girls in the postcards, their dresses are embroidered quite heavily, and of course the gold is just for whatever the festival was. But again, none of the women were wearing this black abaya of the Shias here in Bahrain, but very, very colorfully dressed, and a very strong African influence there. We saw the women were, the people were much more East African looking than those of the other parts of Oman. Well, we stayed there for a couple of days, and then quite reluctantly went back to Mutra and spent an overnight there. Spent most of that evening sitting on the corniche watching the seagulls and the waves on the bay of Mutra. Very sad to leave. It was a wonderful trip. It was quite interesting. That evening when we were in Mutra, we had found a little crummy little cafe where we could sit outside and eat. It was across from the fish market in Mutra on the bay, and apparently was a gathering place for Omanis who come to Mutra from the mountains. They were dressed slightly differently, and we got a good look at the uh, how they greet each other and the socializing that goes on. In fact, it was on that evening when we saw many of these clearly mountain men, greet each other by touching noses. Um, they don't rub them like the Eskimos. It's just simply a quick touch of the nose and a handshake. Um, it has to do with the level of intimacy because I know that the Sultan here, the Emir here in Bahrain, whenever he returns from a trip, you can see on television how some of the people who line up to greet him at the airport touch noses with him. Others touch him on the forehead with their nose. Some touch him on the shoulder with their nose, and some touch him on the hand with their nose. And apparently, this is determined by the level of familiarity between whoever the person is and the Sultan. I'm also told that this Sultan finds this nose touching very unhygienic and wish he could think of some way to stop it. Just a note here, something I mentioned earlier. I heard today at work that this Sultan Qaboos, the current Sultan of the Sultanate of Oman, went to Sandhurst in Britain. In fact, he is a pilot. And Sandhurst is the college where a great many of the members of the royal families, the ruling families from these Arab countries, including, I think, King Hussein of Jordan, where they studied. Around the area of Salalah, we saw a great number of Yemenis. They are physically very different than the Omanis. The Omanis are uh, they're short. The men are short. The women also are short, but they're quite substantially built. The Yemenis, on the other hand, are very small, 5 feet. The men were 5 feet and very slender bodies, with long, thin faces. Look quite different. One of the taxi drivers around Salalah told us about his 10 or 12 years fighting with the rebels, the communist financed rebels from Yemen who came into Salalah. There was a bit of a war going on, not a bit of a war, a real war, for maybe even 14 years until about mid 1970s, paid for by the communist government. Um, this taxi driver said that he spent, I think he said 10 years, maybe 12 years in the mountains with uh, the military until he was quite severely injured and airlifted to Moscow to a hospital where he spent almost a year. This taxi driver spoke English, and the 4 or 5 hours that we spent with him, we egged him on to talk the whole time. He would pull off the road and send us off to look and photograph at something or other. And then we get back in the taxi and say, okay, now the next thing that happened was what? And he told us his whole life story. This district of Dhofar in the south was fairly wealthy. The Arabs have traditionally been slave traders. They would go into primarily Eastern Africa and bring the slaves around to the ports around Salalah, particularly, and take slaves up into the Arab countries and all the way up in through the Ottoman Empire into Turkey. There were also a great number of the traditional pack trails, the caravan trails, through this district, including this empty quarter. One of the